Hello and welcome to the Glass House Festival Poetry from Around the World. We bring to you 85 plus poets coming together in support of creative people impacted by COVID. The Glass House Festival is wholly promoted by the Art Mantram Trust, which is a not-for-profit organization out of Bangalore, India, that has been promoting the arts, artists, and art awareness since 1999. This session is Memories of Stranger, and we're pleased and proud to have with us Chilla Hainanagi, Rui Koizesh, and Chris Agee. Chris Agee is our moderator, who is a poet, essayist, photographer, and editor. He's the editor of Irish Pages, Ireland's premier literary journal, and the Irish Pages Press. Chris, over to you. I know this is going to be a fantastic session.
Thank you, Yumna. The order today will be Hui will read first, Chilla second, and myself third. Each of the readings of the poems, in the case of Hui and Chilla, will be original language and translation, will then be followed by a brief discussion between myself and the poet in question. So without further ado, Hui.
Hello, hi everyone. For me it's a happiness, a honor to be here and participate at the Glass House Festival in India, a country with I have a lot of connections because I was there and some years ago and it was unforgettable. Hi Chris, thank you very much. Hi Sheila, it's nice, very nice to meet you. I'm going to read two poems in my own language, Portuguese, and then the translation to English. The first poem, it's the name is Memory and Time, and I'm going to read to start reading in Portuguese. Em qualquer momento, no começo e no fim, na medida de toda a vida, prostrados toda a pena, permanecemos sem amanhã nem princípio, esbatidos na idade e na distância, saqueados na mentira, apenas juntando a areia ao fundo de um recreio, riscando a areia escurada do nosso entendimento, a simular um amuleto contra o regresso impossível. Não temos trégua, não podemos voltar, e sem ruído, afastamo-nos para longe de onde chamamos, no ar rarefeito entre os ramos dos plátanos de ontem, figuras resumidas a uma branca poeira informe, em quantas inumeráveis semelhanças com a morte. Pressentida ruína, a do íntimo declínio disto tudo, de mais cientes na incerteza como sinal exposto da memória, que esmaga cada abraçada do tempo ao seu embuste, e nos recusa a menor separação do abandono, porque por nada existimos e só acenamos e acenamos, senão para crer no que julgamos não ter acontecido, senão para entender a justa aceitação da nossa vida. In English, time and memory. In any given moment, in the beginning and in the end, in the measure of a lifetime downcast by full sorrow, we remain without tomorrow or principle, faded in the age and distance, plundered by untruth, only able to gather sand in some recreation ground, drawing lines through the dust that bears our understanding, pretending there's some lucky charm against the impossible return. There's no truth. We can't go back, and soundless we shift away towards there where we call from afar, through the rarefied air amongst the branches, the plain trees of yesterday, figures compressed into shapeless white dirt in so many countless deaths, similitudes. sensing decay, this intimate decline of all there is, fully aware of uncertitude, as the exhibited sign of memory, which exposes each brace of time as its own hoax and denies us the slightest parting from forsakenness, since we exist for nothing, and we only wave and we wave, if not only to admit that which we believe didn't happen, except to understand the fair acceptance of our living. The second one, I'm working on a book about the First World War, and I'm going to read a poem. It's a kind of meditation of an Irish soldier reading James Joyce in the Somme in 1960. The name of the poem is Circular Time. I'm going to read first in Portuguese. Na sombra das folhas dos nossos passos, sob o manto de nuvens o dia escureceu. O outono em si próprio gerou e apagou novas e efêmeras constelações. E à janela, olhando os cumes nevados ao longe, envoltos no orvalho de um doce sofrimento, nossos olhos envelheceram. As nossas lembranças e aqueles que amamos teceram palavras esquecidas. E a vida, seguindo e caindo sem fim, pareceu apagar-se, como espuma numa recordação fugaz, um bloco de gelo, transparente, esculpindo, transformando os aspectos do tempo, ou porque os gansos agarravam com as asas as frágeis penas do seu ser, as faziam estilhaçar. Mas era justamente por os anos passados pesarem sobre nós, voltarem ou desaparecerem, que as terras e os vales sentia que suspiravam, deixavam marcar grãos de areia no rosto, como outrora em Connemara, que sentia que a natureza estava prestes a transformar-se, que a nossa sombra estava prestes a desaparecer, que a neve caía, ia caindo, a neve dos teixos, deixando passar a neve, e que o inverno chegava, com raízes escuradas pela água, e a ronda do ano daria outra volta fortuita na charneca, outra volta na primavera e no verão, outro sopro do seu espírito, como um gerânio, que as pétalas desenhassem um curso incessante, invisível, e caíssem na cratera da inocência dos que vivem, dos que morrem. I'm going to read in English. It's quite difficult for me, but I'm going to try. Circular Time. Meditation of an Irish soldier in the Battle of the Somme, reading James Joyce, 1916. In the leafed shadows of our footsteps, under mantle of cloud, the day darkened. Autumn crafted and whipped out new and ephemeral consolations, and by the window, reaching out to distant, snow-dusted peaks, robed in sweet suffering dew, our eyes grew old. Our memories and those we loved weaved a forgotten word of life, ever returning and ever falling, seemed to vanish, like foam of a brief remembrance, an ice block, transparent, shaping and changing the faces of time, or like a shattering of fragile wings, where the geese to try and grab it in full flight. But it was precisely because the passing of the years, waiting on us, was coming back and disappearing, that the lands and the valleys were here singing, were allowed to leave the grains of sand on their face, like long ago in Connemara. Nature seemed to be about to transform. Our shadow was about to disappear. The snow was falling, kept falling. The snow letting the snow through, and the winter arrived with its roots dipped in water. and the turn of the year went yet fortuitously round the earth, through spring and summer, another breath of its spirit, like a geranium whose petals drew an incessant, invisible path, and fell into the crater of the innocence of those who live, of those who die.
Thank you, Hui. Bravo. I know that Mediterranean world. And what we've decided is each poet will take from me a kind of prompt about the pandemic, since the festival is happening in the shadow of this plague and catastrophe, darkening times by the day. And we were chatting a little while ago about your Galatian story, if I'm pronouncing the adjective right, your story from Galatia. So that's a good way in, and I'll just leave it to you for 4 or 5 minutes to tell us about that. I mean, all these, what we're trying to get at perhaps with each of our comments is how plagues and epidemics have kind of haunted our imagination before this hit. And they're very present in European history, from the Black Plague in 1348. For 400 years, there were periodic plagues and epidemics in Europe. So hopefully our little discussions will bring that out in some way.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Yes, this thing of the epidemic, it's that we are living all together in this very strange world. It can get us to a very philosophical and profound thoughts and kind of interpretation of mankind and the destiny of the world and the fragility of the human being. And the question was very interesting because it was about how the pandemic can affect culture and politics but that's a very long discussion. I don't know, we don't have time for that. I think that what we can do is just on every day, every moment, believe in culture and in poetry, in art, because that's one thing that all the epidemic and diseases in the mankind history can't destroy. And I was last year, on the final of last year, I was in Galicia, in the north of Spain, in a very small island. I was in a workshop of translations. I was translating some poets from other countries to Portuguese, and they were translating my poems to their languages. And I was in a very tiny island. The name is the island of the Isla of San Simón, in the coast of Galicia. And it was before the pandemic, and the island is very tiny. It's about 350 squares, and by 50 squares width. And it was a kind of experience of confinement, because I was reading about that island. And that island was a monastery, and in 1842 it was converted to a leper hospital that began to operate there in the final of the 19th century. It was operating there for decades for quarantine, as a quarantine center for all vessels from America whose destination was the ports of north of Spain. It was a kind of quarantine island until 1927. And in 1927 was a kind of center of treatment and prevention of epidemic diseases. And it was, this is very strange, because I was there, especially during the nights, and the island is very, very, very small, and we could walk around the island in the night, and actually there were two small islands, and the bridge, a stone bridge, divided the island for the bigger island from the small one, that which is very, very, very small, because there was a kind of gate in during the quarantines and the leper disease, because the sick people that couldn't have hope of living were I will say in English, were putting there, divided from the other people.
The
So, sorry?
the last resting place.
Yes, and it is a very impressional place, and it's incredible for me because it was before the pandemic, and now with all this that we are living, I have this sound and this memory and this impression, this kind of breeze of the landscape of the island, and it was and feel what was a confinement, because even now we were there, we can only reach the island by boat, and we can make a connection with our times, because we are everyone are how you say lockdown, how you say
Lockdown, yes, in English.
lockdown, and in the island across the centuries, in the island across the centuries, in the monastery times, in the diseases times, and then in the 40s it was a concentration camp of Franco. It was a confinement place. So for me it's confinement beneath confinement. Do you know? It's my mind, and it's a kind of landscape of my.
Looks like a good poem, and it's a perfect. We've run out of time for the 20 minutes, but I think a lot of us are finding a lot of things coming up from what Seamus Heaney called the dream bank, the unconscious, or what's there, you know, what we've always known. And what you've illustrated is there have always been huge pandemics and plagues. And in fact, they've been occurring simultaneously with the contemporary world, but we've managed to wall them off. I mean, measles, tuberculosis, AIDS,
Yes, of course.
and they have always been there. But this is something different because it's, I suppose, jumping off over all the walls.
Yeah.
So I suppose we can come back to this with any of our audience who wants to ask further questions. But
Yes,
I
of
think
course.
to illustrate how in the back of our mind, in the back of European history, for at least 400 years from the Black Death, which took out 50% of Europe, there were these periodic pandemics, which did in fact reshape the feudal world and people's property relations and human relations, and the whole tone of painting, for instance, how Sienese painting changed after the Great Black Death. Anyway, we now going to move on.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Hui. That was beautiful. I look forward to more of them. I look forward to conversing with you outside this Zoom hour. But we now have to.
And thank you. It was a pleasure and an honor to me to be a participant at this beautiful Glass House Festival in India. Thank you very much. I'm honored.
Thank you. It's Yumna to thank, and all the staff. So I'm going to hand over to Chilla, who's going to tell us what she's going to do. She's going to read a couple poems in Hungarian with translations into English. Over to you, without further ado.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for my first online poetry meeting, and actually my first Zoom meeting, although I've seen all the people doing it everywhere around me. So this is very exciting for me in a lot of ways.
Me too. First time.
Maybe we are the only two people in the world who haven't had a Zoom meeting yet until today. So I will read a few short poems and then a few longer ones. We'll see about the time. And I think only with the first one I will read the original Hungarian as well, just for some taste of the language.
Okay.
And the title is in Hungarian, Rés. Vannak szavak, amelyek nem léteznek. Használjuk őket néha a vegyesbolt pultjánál, vagy egy ölelés végeztével, egy temetésen, egy hullámvasúton, egy fürdés alkalmával, két másik láb közé szorulva hisszük, hogy kimondtuk, hogy valamit mondtunk, és egy életünk át nem veszük észre, hogy olyankor csak résére nyílt alkakkal mosolyogtunk a saját térdünkre. This was translated into English by Rochelle Potkar, very good Indian poet actually. And the title is, English title is Gap. There are words that don't exist. We use them by the counters at the grocery store, at the end of a hug, at a funeral, at a roller coaster, while taking a bed wedged between two other legs. We believe we said them and don't notice that ipso facto we just parted our lips and smiled at our own knees. The next one is also a short poem translated by me into English. Gravity. I have a friend. He doesn't believe in gravity. No evidence will move him. I pushed him out of the tower and he just left. And then on his funeral, the leaves fell upwards from the tree. I don't believe in anything anymore. The next one is titled Igor, and it's about an imaginary Russian boy. The boys who study English at university are almost always very handsome. Their eyes are as if they knew everything, but also nothing. This would bathe them in a shade that isn't invented yet. They will all be very successful in their own way, some in this, some in that, and will make love to beautiful, fragile, bashful girls while wearing socks. Igor is colorblind, paints chaotic pictures, and is mad at colors. I ask him, panting, how was it? Хорошо. He sighs wearily, as if that was all he or me knows in Russian. He studies English in Moscow, but he's with me now escaping. I can't remember whether from her mom or Putin. He has checkered socks, except for the one that has Spider-Man on it. He doesn't like talking to me because the accent I'm using doesn't even exist. That is nonsense, but he knows. He has to say things like this in order to keep me in his bed. You are my favorite painter. Хорошо, he sighs, as if that was all. He's on the phone with his mother, or Putin, hangs up, catching his breath. By the crosswalk, I glue my hands to my ears, like the city inside the jar. He isn't paying attention. Like inside the cold river, I dip my toes in the road. Look, I tell him, like the Yenifei. Should we rather go home and make love? Хорошо. One day, just out of boredom, he starts to paint me on the wall. My colors are completely different. I laugh, but in Hungarian, the brush doesn't stop. Igor mostly falls in love with short-haired, thick-limbed women, in my opinion. Whether he would be able to passionately fall in love with Putin, I can't be sure about, but it's probable. Pusztját a Budet boleje, I sometimes hear at night as he whimpers, locking himself in the bathroom. Хорошо. I whisper to the door and pack my things up. But I think he might have been called Vladimir after all. When I wanted to take Grandma to Scotland, Grandpa didn't understand. I appeared in the door, told them where we are going, and that Grandpa, even though he looks like Kennedy would look if he would have lived to be Grandpa's age, but Grandpa is not coming with us. He'll be governing the United States from home after he decides which states he wants to unite. Grandpa can't see the color green well, so there would be no point in taking him to Scotland. He didn't understand. Where are you packing? He kept asking Grandma, but never waited for the answer. Went back to the first room to open windows. I went after him. I'm going to bring her back, I kept saying, but Grandpa was just shaking his head no, and tirelessly iterated that he has to go. Days went by like this. I sat in the corner of my suitcase. Grandpa stopped packing and just feebly watched Grandpa opening the window. He was looking for something. I have to go, he iterated, but not as if he was apologizing, or at least explaining anything with it. it was just a sentence becoming reality by getting further outside of his head. Finally, one day I woke up and saw that Grandpa painted everything green. He left the windows open. That night, Ivy climbed inside. Grandma was already awake. She knew exactly what happened, but never explained it to me. Grandpa was nowhere, left no message behind, only the color, living and dead, that he could never see well, but still created to perfection.
That was great. So I'm just going to ask you the same question we're all dwelling on, which is, how has the pandemic impacted on Hungary and Central Europe in some cultural, political, social way? Or maybe you have some kind of vestigial European memory of plagues and epidemics before this pandemic.
Now that you were talking about it, now that Rui was talking about it, I was trying to, because I had some thoughts initially, but I was trying to think like that if I have any kind of connection to any kind of plague. And I realized that even though these last months, plague is, and this pandemic is all that we talk about, all that you see is most that you think about, it's so hard to imagine a state where I wasn't even thinking about anything like this. And actually, I think it's not really a part of the history of Slovakia and Hungary, as in what they teach and what they talk about. So that is not really a topic there, historically either. So weirdly enough, I don't think I had any thoughts on any kind of plague and pandemics, and I didn't have any recollections, like any connections to it. And actually, I think that is kind of similar to what we have now in a way, because we read all these things, we see all these things, we hear all about it, but we don't have a direct. I mean, unfortunately, a lot of people do. But when the ones that we don't have a direct connection, but we go out and wear all those masks, and we are very afraid in a way, but still we can quite put our hands around it because we don't see it. I mean, we know that it exists, but it's just so hard to grasp it all. And my situation was also peculiar in a way that for me there were 3 countries that were very important. So since the beginning, there is this map opened on my phone and on my computer also, where you can check the progress of each country. And every morning I woke up, I checked Turkey, Slovakia, and Hungary. And it became all so chaotic. Fortunately, Slovakia and Hungary are not as infected as Turkey is, so most of my family, at least I can feel that they are safer where they are. But after a while, it became numbers, and I saw the whole world in this map with a black background and with red countries. That was the website that I found in the beginning, and I just kept looking at that, and it all had some unfathomable atmosphere to it.
Have you written anything? Have you written any poems or prose yourself?
I am supposed to work on something. I have a scholarship, and unfortunately I couldn't go anywhere with that. But on the other hand, I'm finishing a novel, previous one, from a previous scholarship, and one of my characters, because it has 7 characters, and one of them is, and there is no pandemic or anything, but she never leaves the house. And I knew that I'm missing something. I knew that there is something that I don't understand about her. And I just realized after a few weeks in the pandemic that now I can rewrite that chapter and understand more about, even though our motivations about why we didn't leave the house are different, but I could use that kind of.
So another confinement theme, like Hui. Strange. No poems, though. I haven't actually written any poem. Well, actually, just before the pandemic struck, or maybe it was just at the beginning it was at the beginning. I wrote a poem about my neighbor in the house I have in Croatia, who chopped down a cypress, beautiful cypress, at least 200 years old. So that will be the year of the coronavirus, the time he took down the cypress. And it was like a bereavement, because every night that it was clear for 20 years, I looked at that tree. So that's my only literary initiative. Just before we turn to me, or Celia, do you have, sorry, Chilla, looks like Celia in English. Chilla, did you have any other ideas or reflections on the pandemic in your own imaginative consciousness?
Can I just...
Yeah, sure.
Because I was listening with Chilla. I have also a scholarship. I have to work on that because I wrote my new book. I have a scholarship for that. But with this pandemic, it's became very difficult to write. I don't know why. Because it's strange. It's a kind of paradox. Because it's actually, we could write even more now for different reasons. But I don't know. We are something new.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Yes,
It's very difficult to write now. I don't know.
I think we are in kind of a limbo, because I was also thinking about it, because I should be writing this thing, but I really can't get myself, and it's not laziness, but I think that we are in a kind of limbo where it is hard to put down anything concrete, any sentence that has a beginning and an ending, because we are in a state where we don't see. Actually, the beginning is also a bit hazy, but the ending we don't see at all. So I
don't see the ending.
This limbo that prevents me from putting the dot at the end of the sentence.
Yes.
Right.
There's a word in English, interregnum. It's the period between something ending and something starting, like liberation in Europe. There's war, there's peace, but there's always a period of liberation for a few weeks. I happened to be in Bosnia when the war ended, and it was liberation. And I think we're in some kind of interregnum, and I think that a lot of the things that are being said to be permanent changes are probably not that permanent. But I think the impact, I'll come back to this when I offer a few reflections. I think that the impact long-term and medium to long-term will be enormous as this thing plays out. I mean, pubs and restaurants and social distancing, maybe that is a little more ephemeral. It's not going to last as long. But I think the way this is spreading and fracturing societies and emerging in different places will be very, very long-term. And clearly no country is safe. No well-off country, no European country, no North American country, while this stuff is happening and at this scale in Brazil or Russia or India. Chilla, just before we turn to me, do you have any other thoughts? Any creative impacts that you had, or any reflections on Hungary? Hungary, which had already been a little bit obsessed, I think it's fair to say, about its borders. Whether that has intensified things, justified things in certain people's minds. Anything you'd like to say just before? You've got a couple more minutes of your time. But you don't need to, of course.
Well, I can just briefly say about this, that this has always been a very good state for me, that I grew up in Slovakia and then I moved to Hungary and lived there for about 7 years. So I could have a distance from the Slovakian politics, because I could say that I'm living in Hungary. I could also have a distance from Hungarian politics, because I could say that no, I'm actually living in Slovakia. And I can do the same for Turkey, which is also a bit complicated at the time. But I think that the craziness that with all these borders and all the eagerness that some governments have to use and abuse certain situations, which should be addressed maybe more empathetically. I think it has all become so crazy that sometimes it's just so painful to look at. So I have kind of opinions, but I'm mostly just trying to keep myself away from politics, because it makes me very sad.
As they say in English, keep your powder dry. until you really have something to say. Yes, that's what I feel like. I'm doing a little bit of prose, but I'll come back to that. Anyway, thank you,
Thank you
Sheila.
very much.
I'm going to read some poems now. I was going to save the little last poem that I was going to read, a little short one, right to the end, which has become quite famous on social media. But I think I'll read it at the beginning and the end. Because actually, one time in 2013, I did think about the pandemic. And this book is called Blue Sambar Moon, a microepic. It has 175 very short poems, which cumulatively are a microepic. They're kind of like little episodes in my life. A friend of mine called it an emotional architecture for 10 years of my life. No holds barred. Everything that I thought and felt, and a lot that happened to me, was registered. It's also an account of a death in the family, my daughter. But this little poem occurred when I was flying from Sarajevo through Vienna and then landing in London. And the subtext to, I think, one of the words here is splendiferous. The subtext, I think, is capitalism, actually, or the splendors of our wealth. It has no title, it just starts with the first line, like all the micropoems. They echo, to a certain degree, W.G. Sebald, who had a very, very fine book called Unrecounted, where he had about 40 micropoems, like little doors of an advent calendar that you opened, and you got a flash. But when you put them all together, it was kind of luminous, and it had a big impact on my writing. This is my fourth book, and it impacted on my third and subsequently this book. So each of these small poems just step in to my life flow, you could say. There it is, splendiferous London, lit bridges girded over the serpentine Thames, jeweled honeycomb of hope and joys and love, misery and power. This century's high plateau, vulnerable before the plagues and epidemics that will surely come. Flight from Vienna, 16 February 2013. I don't know why it occurred to me, but it was like an epiphany. The city below me, very vulnerable, like we got to the last plateau after centuries. It could be taken away from us easily. Just like anybody can be taken away from you easily in life. So the next three poems are going to be about bereavements, my own and collective. I'll read three poems of bereavement, maybe more. I think no, three is sufficient. And then come back to the little poem, which started to get going on the internet like a virus, if not exactly viral. I posted and people were, sending it around, and finally it was broadcast on the poetry program and RTE. So the entire nation heard this little prediction, and I'm actually rather proud of it, to be quite honest. I mean, it's an ancient trope with poetry to have foresight rather than just hindsight. And in fact, it wasn't difficult. It's obvious. Several people have predicted it. Professor Ian Golden at Oxford predicted that a pandemic would come and it would crash the economy. Bill Gates predicted that there would be a huge pandemic that would kill 10 million people. So there have been predictions. The real question is, it wasn't difficult to predict. What is surprising me now is where were our political leaders? Even the WHO a few months ago was predicting it was coming. It's a very good question why we did not prepare for this disaster. And I think it has something to do with the bubble that we all live, relating to normality and the sun rises every day, it will rise the next day, and so forth. So, but my experience over the last 20 years since Miriam died has been very, very different. I'm going to read 3 poems about the death in the family, or 2 poems about the death in the family, and 1 about collective bereavement. The title of this poem is in Prvo Selo, which in Croatian means first village, and this is about the presence of dead ghosts who are always with you. Whether they actually exist in reality or not, it's neither here nor there. We all have memories of the dead, and in that sense, they are our ghosts. And in the village, there's a tradition of, in the village where I have the Croatian house, there's a tradition of leaving a small token to indicate a visitor. Never a note, just a token. And you can always work out who did it. It's a kind of Slavic tradition, if I may say so. It's not something that would happen in the English-speaking world. So various things are left, and you know exactly who left them. But one summer, something was left, and we could never figure out who left it. And a very close friend of mine said, "Your dead left it." And this is an old village idea that knocked around in my head for a few years, and suddenly the poem came out. In Prvo Selo, in the tradition of the place, once or more a summer, we return to our evergreen Zhernovo door and find hung, lent, or left round the bronzed handle or smoothed limestone threshold some ghost token of a visitor, a bow of straw or sheer headscarf or terrace cushion or wildflower or bough plucked nearby at a moment's notice. Sometimes, too, a gift materializes. Some tomatoes, perhaps, or grappa in a second-hand bottle, maybe a book or compote, lavender and oregano out of the adjacent fields, small cakes from a neighbor's kitchen. And if merely a folded piece of paper, always with neither name nor note. Thus, out of this village silence, immemorial as anonymous, you come to realize you've been expected to intuit whoever it might have been who wished or needed seeing you at the dog days missed periphery. The once in a blue moon too, the gift giver or visit, like a ghost guested all summer, asked after, stays unknown despite the guesswork. This is on the terrace in the house, which is on an island called Korčula, which is not too far from Dubrovnik in the Adriatic. The rains, of course, are lovely in Dalmatia. You start to long for rains. In Ireland, you're so sick of the Irish rain, you couldn't express it. But after 6 weeks of scorching sun in Croatia, rains are, let me assure you, absolutely beautiful. And they come very quickly. They lay the water on, and then they pass very quickly. So this was right after a rain on the terrace one evening. After rains, a large seed parachute from a plant's pod floated up from the night yard and rose into the door's lamp shine on fresh air's slightest breath, like thistledown in slow motion, a snow crystal, or some sea creature out of the abysmal depths. I knew before I tried I would never find it. It was so linty and delicate, so immaterial, it would vanish as spider's web on the wet earth's solidities. It reminded me instantly of that first May thistledown after apocalypse. When I moved forward, it moved off and down towards the dark beyond the table legs. When I searched the veranda flagstones half lit in penumbra, it was nowhere to be found. When I shone a flashlight close up on the stone, there was still no trace of its image. A trout fly reeled in. Some low undercurrent probably took it from my ken. It felt like a last omen, approached and touched me, and returned to the night. That, I think, is it. But I'm going to read the little poem again. I don't know, it's like a little tiny brooch, beautifully made brooch, I have to say. I'm not saying the poem's beautifully made, but the brooch, you know, one of these beautiful brooches, jeweled honeycomb. And I'm quite proud of it because the images are solid. They will, as Heaney said, they will pass through, or as Salon said, they will pass through. And I think it's like a little bijou mouse that saw it coming. The small, not the big, saw it coming. So I'd like to end with that, and then we can turn to some final discussion. And in this microepic part of the book, the captions are most definitely a part of the poem. Every poem, almost every poem, has a place and a date, and they give it a time signature because this whole microepic is about emotion. And some people have the idea that emotion can be controlled by language. No, emotion controls language. It does not necessarily give itself to language. So sometimes the swift is absolutely necessary, at least in this period of time. I was doing swift poems, rather like Matisse's sketches, right? So if we see Matisse's sketches of a female legs or female thighs, he only needs a few lines, and the image occurs in your head. That's where images occur, not on the page. On the page, we do not need impasto. We can do sketches. And sometimes they're very good for emotional life. So I will end with that. There it is. Splendiferous London. Lit bridges girded over the serpentine Thames. Jeweled honeycomb of hope and joys and love. Misery and power. This century's high plateau. Vulnerable before the plagues and epidemics that will surely come. Flight from Vienna, 16 February 2013. Well, thank you for listening to me. Anyway, let's have a discussion. I mean, I'll throw out my ideas. Years ago, when I was about 18, I read a book. A Journal of the Plague Year by Daniel Defoe. Now, everybody knows Daniel Defoe's Robinson and Crusoe, but not many people know this Plague Year Journal. It was all made up. He actually didn't experience a plague as an adult, but he remembered it as a child. In 1665 in London, there was a terrible plague. And it's just an example of the plague presence in European history. And immediately I thought of that. And I also thought of a book I read years ago too, of course, and many people have read it. Subsequently, La Peste by Camus, which really is totally prophetic. The doctor who has no higher faith, no belief in anything, any afterlife, but is in the hospital doing what he has to do, doing his duty. Very, very close to Camus' prophecy, we can now say. So it's very interesting how literature can, in a small way, in My Little Brooch, or in a big way, like Camus' La Peste, really say something that is coming, that has a certain kind of foresight. So that's the thing that came to mind. And also, just to pick up on Hui's point, I was out sailing, which I don't actually do very much of in Croatia, but some friends invited me out, and we were sailing around Korčula, little islands, little deserted islands everywhere, desert islands. And I said, what is that island there? What's that? And he said, oh, that's the Plague Island. I said, really? Yeah. And he said, yeah, that's where for a couple hundred years, plague boats were forced to stop, discharge their sailors, and they were just left there, mostly. They either died there, or after a certain period of time, people decided that they might be allowed back into the village or into the town. It was actually an ancient city in a part of the Venetian Empire. And people brought out villagers, peasants, so-called, like the peasants who rescued the Rohingya off Indonesia when no one else would do it. That's the peasant mentality at its best. They would bring some food and sustenance out. But mostly they were left to die. And then this Croatian, who was quite a progressive guy, didn't mean it badly. He said, well, we just let to die like we let the refugees die. It's exactly the same. And that seems rather prophetic as well. We just let those people in the third world who are up against it die. But that's going to be more difficult in my view in future. So those are my two memories, or three. Camus, Defoe, and a little sailing excursion last summer. But that seemed very prophetic when he said, we're just going to let them die. By the way, is this on me? Am I okay? Am I coming? Yeah, okay. Because I'm only seeing one of your, I guess you don't see yourself, right?
No, I was listening you and I was wondering how we can make this all connection, because I was listening about Croatia and you talk about Srebrenica, Bosnia, and you talk about Zibald, the island, or the Plague Island around Korčula, in that such wonderful place that is Dalmatia.
Dalmatia.
And this is a kind of thing of European connections that we can make between memory and landscape, and it remembered me also the Thomas Mann, the Magic Mountain.
Yes, of course.
Was even a kind of confinement, because I was hearing you about Croatia, about Bosnia, the Balkans. They are very melancholic places, and I was wondering that if all this is, it's not a kind of a mixture between beauty and what is fragile, everything is so so fragile, so ephemeral, and so it's kind of
life is tough, but it's also fragile.
Yeah, and no, because it was very interesting, because I think that poetry and art have to make this kind of connections and between the place, the sense of the place, and the memory, and it's also a kind of confinement, mental confinement, and I was reading this book.
Yes, John Berger.
Yeah.
Yes, he loved the village too, the Spanish village, the Pyrenees village. I actually have read quite a lot of him, and what he says about villages happens to be in the Hispanic world, but it's probably, well, I'm sure it's true in Slovakia as well, these kind of villages. I'm sure Chila knows exactly what we're talking about. And maybe Chila has a reflections on this.
Yeah, of course.
Finish Berger. Finish Berger. We have a
No,
few
no,
minutes.
no. I was just reading the last sentence of the book.
Uh-huh.
It's because you were asking what about culture, the influence of a pandemic in the culture and in our way of life. And John Berger, in the last sentence of this book, he wrote that the abstraction of capitalism survives by forcing the majority whom it exploits to define their own interests as narrowly as possible. This was once achieved by extensive deprivation. Today, in the developed countries, it is being achieved by imposing a false standard of what is and what is not desirable.
Exactly.
So,
Yeah.
so this is we have to fight against this abstraction of the new a kind of new order in the world that because of the pandemics, someone we don't know are imposing us. You know.
I think it's made us challenge that kind of thinking. I really do. I think that's one of the long-term impacts. Chilla, you must have something to say on all this, I'm sure.
Actually, this reminded me what you said earlier, Chris, about how you are afraid of some long-term effects of this pandemic, and that is one of the fears. But I also have this other fear that this introspection, this kind of self-realization that some people seem to be having, and that seems to have kind of constructive mental effect, maybe this situation, that these might not have a long term effect. But I hope that I'm wrong in that. So that it seems to me that now humanity and civilization is at the crossroads, and it can take away a lot of things that it can use later to improve their way of living, their empathy, and also the way they perceive each other and themselves. And I just actually I do believe I do have some kind of optimism about it. So in the end of the day, I just kind of hope that once this is over, who knows when and how, and actually how is a very big question. Is this going to be over? That we can, what we can take away from it, it's not going to be null. So it's not going to be like we take away all the negative effects and then try to build something, but neglect the actual, so to speak, psychological knowledge that we got out of this whole situation. So
I think
Yeah.
this X-ray image, it's not mine. I picked it up from someone. Said it's like an X-ray. It's revealing everything. All the weaknesses, all the fractures, if you want to use medical terminology, like all of a sudden within weeks, they got all the street people off the streets in London. They put them in hotels. And the hotels were suddenly interested in putting the street people in the hotels because they had no other customers. So we should be able to do this kind of thing pretty easily.
Yeah.
I think that I was reading a very, very good book called A Month in Siena by a Libyan writer. And he was talking about the Black Death. And he said, the art, Sienese art, I mentioned it before. Again, borrowing. I'm a bit of a magpie. I borrowed this idea that Sienese art changed profoundly after the Black Death. And he simply says in a line, he said, art changed because man changed, meaning humanity changed. And I think it's going to have a big impact on the way we look at the world, the way we look at our relationships. We will not be able to go back. There is never any going back. So it's going to have, I think, really big impact in the medium to long term. It may seem at first that things are going back to normal, but I think there have been some kind of psychological changes. And one of the things that I found interesting, if I can just turn it to personal for a moment, is that one of the little bridges in this book between There's some reflections on Holocaust sites I experienced and so forth in Croatia. There's some big camps up near Hungary, Jasenovats and so forth. I write about them. How do you do this bridge across the abyss, historical abyss, to something as bad as that? So that's a kind of reflective bridge that the book deals with, but also there's a bridge that's important between our own personal sorrows and collective sorrows. And the poem about Srebrenica is a poem about the impact of world historical bereavement. And bereavement is a world historical phenomenon, from Israel, Palestine, to Myanmar, to Black Lives Matter, to Yemen. Bereavement, when it's gathered together socially and politically, becomes an enormous power. And that is going to manifest itself with the pandemic. It will be a global bereavement of enormous levels. And one thing people don't forget is loss. They might forget the latest politics, but they don't forget why they lost people. So I think that is going to be huge. If this thing just keeps escalating, bereavement will be huge. Do you want to say anything, Chilla or Hui?
I just hope that we can go back to the old world and meet each other on the real life.
Well, we can stay in touch for sure.
Yeah, because normally at this point in the festival it would be drinking and in that part would begin now after the panels.
Oh, the fun part.
Yeah.
Basically the fun part. Yeah, of course.
A little bit fun, yeah.
All of it's fun. It's a different kind of fun, A little bit like intellectuals, a little bit like doctors. They do the diagnoses. If they're lucky, they can do a good prognosis. But you know that medics, when they go off duty, are pretty crazy. It helps and so forth. So literary world.
Yeah. Let's hope we get to do that craziness too.
Well, it's been a tremendous pleasure. Thank you, Yumna. We went over a little bit. Of course, you can always cut the last bit. It's really been interesting being very close, looking at both your faces when you're reading. Less interesting for me to put myself through that experience, but very interesting in seeing close-up poetry readings. And let us just thank the festival, Glass House, and what I would say to anybody who's watching, join the Zoom room for questions and answers right now. So goodbye, various global listeners.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.